This was not just a battle. It was the night the world split in two. On one side, the Persian Empire, ancient and vast, its kings ruling as gods for 2 centuries. On the other, a young conqueror, barely 30 years old, whose ambition burned hotter than the deserts he crossed. Here, in the dust of Gaugamela, tens of thousands would fall. Here, Alexander would gamble everything. And here, Darius, King of Kings, would face the final reckoning. This is where empires died, and where history itself was reborn in blood.
Dawn crawled over the plain like a blade drawn from a sheath, glinting cold across trampled dust and the rims of bronze shields. The air was already heavy with the smell of animals and oil, leather and iron, the sour breath of men who had not slept. Beyond the haze, the Persian line stretched so far it seemed to meet the horizon itself, banners the size of sails, spear forests swaying, wheels creaking under gilded weight. A carpet of men and movement and dread. At its heart stood the chariot of Darius, high and gleaming, axle greased, horses restless, the King of Kings aloft beneath a sun disk. Around him, the immortals glittered like a moving wall, their ranks disciplined and deep, their faces calm as statues. Trumpets spoke in bright metal bursts. Scribes unrolled tablets. Messengers threaded the sea of soldiers like fish in a current, passing the last instructions along a body too large to feel its own fingertips. Opposite them, the Macedonian line looked small. It did not glitter. It did not dazzle. It was a hard geometry of men and intent, angle and edge, the phalanx blades, the sarissas, tilted just above the shoulder like a field of steel reeds catching the light. Horses snorted white into the chill, stamping, the companion cavalry leaning forward over the mane as if already falling into the future. At their point, a young king sat his warhorse, black, broad-chested, with a bite scar along the lip, Bucephalus. The rider's helmet was plain. His eyes were not. Between them lay a floor the Persians had ordered scraped smooth, stones dragged away, ruts filled, a canvas prepared for scythed chariots to carve their signatures across living flesh. Far out on the wings, beyond sight from the center, patrols felt each other like blind men in fog, hooves thudding through dust, a hiss of arrow flight's testing range, a scream cut short and swallowed by distance. The sun kept rising, steady and impartial. Listen closely to the heat before the fire. To the sounds that always come first. The dry rasp of a strap tugged tight. A knuckle cracking. The wooden sigh of a spear shaft settling against a palm. A prayer whispered into the seam of a helmet where no one can hear it but the speaker and whatever god is unlucky enough to be listening. A boy from a hill village presses his lips to an amulet he carved himself, the lines crude and the meaning perfect. A Persian archer fingers his father's ring and thinks of a pomegranate orchard behind a clay wall and the laughter of children running through it. These details endure in a way the grand ones sometimes do not. A wind came, small at first, then pushing the dust in long slow ribs along the earth. It caught at the tassels of standards and tugged at tunics and made the horses show their whites. It brought with it the smell of pitch from the chariot axles and the rich, animal heat of elephants waiting in the Persian rear. Those dark-browed gods of muscle shifting their weight, ears fanning, minds steady and old. It brought the bitter leather of bowstrings and the metallic hush of 100,000 things that can cut. Alexander's hand rose and fell in small measures, like a conductor waking up an orchestra, a tilt to the right, the line inching with him to brew a space no one else could yet see, a quiet message sent like a vein under skin to the Thessalian cavalry on the left, an adjustment so narrow it looked like a breath. Across the plain, Darius marshals, armored to the throat, pointed and debated, following rehearsed patterns, chariots forward along the smooth lanes, archers massed, cavalry sweeping to enfold. Decorum in the face of danger. Ceremony around a blade. There is always a second right before the killing begins, when the world becomes precise and merciless. When numbers tighten into outcomes. When the shape of the field matters more than the shape of a crown. When the weight of a spearhead and the angle of a wrist outweigh the sentences of statesmen. It arrived now, as the first Persian drums rolled like distant thunder and a spine of sound ran down the host. A chariot screamed forward, iron sides gleaming from its hubs, horses driven mercilessly, wheels combing the earth. Another followed, then a fan of them, and the ground began to tremble under their combined hunger. Persian cavalry on the left unfurled like a black wing. The bowman lifted and held, a long breath drawn across 1,000 chests. The first arrows leapt skyward, a cloud that paused at its height like a flock turning, then dropped with the hiss of rain that cuts. Shields lifted. Sarissas planted. The Macedonian line bent but did not break. On the far right, riders leaned, heels down, eyes toward the slash of space Alexander had been drawing with his small hand motions, a corridor through chaos, invisible until it was too late. Men began to die in the ways men always die at such moments, not in heroic tableau, but in stumbles and shocks, in the wet cough after the first impact, in the panic that can find even the brave if the world tips too suddenly. And yet, there was order inside the storm. A rhythm unique to this army, to this leader, to this day. Voices traveled the files, short commands, almost affectionate, learned in a dozen other fights across rivers and mountains that had taught these men to move as a single thought. As the next wave of chariots cut forward, ranks opened and closed like a living hinge, letting the death carts through to be speared from the flanks, horses screaming, wheels lurching, blades tearing nothing but air. In the Persian center, Darius' charioteer tightened his hands on the reins. He could see the enemy king now, small, far, undeniable, a sunburnt figure under a plain crest whose calm seemed an affront. Around him the immortals swayed, gold catching fire in sunlight, their ranks deep enough to absorb fear and return it as confidence. Yet in the very confidence was a flaw, a faith in size that did not account for speed, a devotion to ceremony that did not notice the tiny empty spaces opening like cracks in ice at the far end of the field. A Macedonian soldier swallowed against a dry throat and tasted dust and blood and the iron in his own mouth where he had bitten through his lip without knowing. He pressed his shoulder into the shield rim of the man beside him and felt the press return, the oldest reassurance. Another man, older, scarred, laughed once, a single bark, at the memory of a night river and a different battle when he had thought that had surely been the worst the earth could ask of him. He was wrong. The earth always asks for more. The sun lifted. The shadow of the Macedonian right crept in the direction of the Persian line. Somewhere behind the Persian center, elephants shuffled, handlers striking their legs with goads, the animals' patience thinning into anger. Somewhere beyond the Macedonian left, Thessalian horsemen squinted into the haze and saw, as if for the first time, the full width of the task before them. Trumpets again. A roll of drums. A pause so sharp it cut the air. Then the ground itself seemed to lean as the two fronts heaved toward each other in earnest, the space between empires collapsing to the length of a spear. This is where the knife enters the map. This is where the old world meets the young one at a single point and will not both survive. But before the first line buckles and the first king chooses flight or death, understand how these lines came to be here, how a murder in a theater and a boy with a teacher, an empire heavy with memory and a throne unsteady with fear, set this morning in motion. The dust is lifting. The charge is forming. And the story that will decide who writes tomorrow is about to break. The world did not stumble into this collision by chance. Long before dust rose at Gaugamela, the map of power was already trembling, lines drawn and redrawn by ambition, betrayal, and the slow weight of time. To understand the final showdown, we must first step back, to a world before the thunder, when one empire still seemed unshakable, and another had only just learned to bare its teeth. For 2 centuries, Persia had been the beating heart of empire. The Achaemenids, descendants of Cyrus the Great, ruled lands so vast that no single horizon could contain them. From the valleys of the Nile to the gardens of Babylon, from the mountains of Anatolia to the edges of India, Persian banners waved. Roads linked these faraway provinces, carrying royal messengers who could traverse 1,000 miles in days. Gold flowed into the treasuries at Susa and Persepolis. To many, Persia looked eternal. But beneath the weight of glory, cracks were forming. Satraps. The governors of the great provinces grew wealthy and independent, often ruling like kings in their own right. Corruption seeped through the court. Conspiracies simmered. The empire that once marched united now moved in fragments, its edges fraying like an old cloak. The people whispered of heavy taxes, of armies raised but never paid, of nobles drunk on luxury while soldiers starved. And in the west, where the Aegean Sea washed against rocky shores, another story was unfolding. Greece, once a patchwork of proud city-states, had bled itself dry in the Peloponnesian War. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, each had risen, fought, and fallen into exhaustion. While they quarreled, a kingdom long dismissed as a backwater watched and waited, Macedonia. Its king, Philip II, understood what others did not. He forged unity through steel and vision. He reshaped the Macedonian army, lengthening the spears of his infantry until they stood like a moving forest of death, drilled to perfection in the phalanx. He built cavalry into a hammer that could smash enemy lines apart. He mixed cunning diplomacy with ruthless war. And city by city, battle by battle, he bent Greece beneath his will. Yet Macedonia's true weapon was not the father, but the son. Alexander. Born in 356 BCE, taught by Aristotle, heir to a hardened throne. He grew not in the gardens of palaces but in the campfires of soldiers, hearing tales of Achilles and dreaming not of peace, but of conquest. He watched his father crush enemies and learned a lesson he would never forget: fear and respect are carved by blood. Still, in these years before war, the ordinary man or woman, whether Greek or Persian, could not see the storm gathering. In the villages of Anatolia, farmers bent over fields, unaware that armies would soon trample them into dust. In the markets of Babylon, merchants counted their coins, never dreaming that their city would one day kneel before a foreign king. In Macedon, children chased each other in the shadow of stone walls, ignorant that their generation would be marched east across deserts and rivers, chasing a dream larger than any one life. But history has no mercy for the innocent. One spark, one death, was all it would take to set the world ablaze. And that spark was coming. But one decision, one blade in the dark, would change everything, and unleash a war the world had never seen before. History often hinges not on armies, but on a single heartbeat. One man's fall, one knife in the shadows, one moment when destiny walks into a banquet hall and does not walk out again. For Philip II of Macedon, that moment came in the summer of 336 BCE. The king who had broken Greece, who had welded city-states into a league under his spear, was walking into the theater at Igi to celebrate his daughter's marriage. The air was thick with music, laughter, the scent of roasted meats, and the triumph of a king who believed his work complete. Soon, he would march east to humble Persia itself. But then, steel flashed. A bodyguard lunged. A blade cut deep. And Philip fell in front of his people, his blood soaking the ground of his own triumph. Panic erupted. Screams tore through the air. In an instant, the most powerful man in Greece was dead. The assassin was cut down where he stood, his motives forever blurred by rumor, revenge, conspiracy, foreign coin. But the result was clear. Macedonia had lost its king. And in the chaos of grief, suspicion, and fear, a young man stepped forward. Alexander, 20 years old. Son of Philip and Olympias, heir to the kingdom, but also a boy many doubted. Could he command armies hardened under his father? Could he tame rival generals? Could he keep Greece chained under Macedon's spear? He answered with fire. Thebes rose in rebellion, thinking the death of Philip was the death of Macedon. Alexander marched with merciless speed. He surrounded the city, broke its walls, and unleashed a slaughter so absolute that the ruins smoldered for days. 6,000 were killed. 30,000 sold into slavery. Only temples and the house of Pindar were spared. Thebes, gone. The message was unmistakable. To Greece, resist and you will burn. To Persia, Macedon lives, and its king is no boy. Far to the east, in the great courts of Susa and Babylon, the news reached another ruler. Darius III. He was not the first choice of Persia. He had risen to the throne amid palace intrigues and assassinations, elevated less by his strength than by the weakness of others. He inherited a throne built on centuries of tradition, but also on corruption, unrest, and the dangerous arrogance of nobles who had grown too powerful. And now, reports flooded in, a new Macedonian king had crossed into Asia Minor. At first, Darius dismissed him. A boy playing at war. A pretender chasing his father's shadow. But Alexander's moves were not the fumbling steps of youth. They were the precise strikes of a predator. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait that divided Europe from Asia. It was more than a crossing. It was a declaration. He hurled a spear into the soil and proclaimed the land not as Persia's, but as his gift to the gods. A gesture, a symbol, a warning. Persian satraps, the governors of Asia Minor, gathered their forces to repel him. They trusted numbers, cavalry, and the pride of an empire that had crushed Greece before. But they underestimated speed. They underestimated will. They underestimated the man who carried the name of Alexander. Behind the clashing of armies, propaganda worked like fire in dry grass. In Greece, Alexander spoke of liberating Asia from Persian tyranny. In Persia, scribes painted him as a reckless invader, a foreign barbarian who would be crushed under the weight of the King of Kings. But propaganda cannot stop iron from meeting iron. The spark had been lit. Macedon and Persia were no longer two distant powers glaring across seas. They were locked, eye to eye, their armies moving closer with every step. The march to war had begun. And no one, not king, not soldier, not God, could stop it now. The boy king had crossed the threshold, and the empire of Darius moved to meet him. The first fire of war was about to ignite, and it would draw blood. The crossing was complete. The Hellespont lay behind them, its waters now a boundary not just of land, but of destiny. With 37,000 men, Alexander had stepped onto the soil of Asia. Against him, the Persian Empire could summon hundreds of thousands. The balance of numbers was absurd. But war is not always a matter of numbers. It is a matter of speed, precision, and will. The Persians knew he was coming. Satraps of Asia Minor, men who ruled in Darius' name, had gathered their cavalry and mercenaries near the river Granicus. A narrow, treacherous crossing, its banks steep, its waters cold. They thought it the perfect trap. Force the Macedonians to fight while crossing, crush them midstream, and drown Alexander's ambition before it could even begin. On the morning of May 334 BCE, the trap was set. Persian nobles, armored in scale and mounted on powerful horses, lined the far bank. Their mercenary infantry, hardened Greek veterans, waited in reserve. Behind them, banners rippled in the wind. They believed this would be another marathon, another humiliation of Greece. Alexander saw it differently. He did not hesitate. He did not linger. He ordered his men forward. Cavalry surged into the river, hoofs thrashing against current, shields raised against a storm of arrows. The river boiled with chaos, men slipping, drowning, struck down midstream. And then, in the thick of the current, the Persians charged down the bank. Iron clashed with iron. Spears splintered in the water. Horses screamed as they were cut down, their riders dragged under the current. At the center of it, Alexander led. He was not content to direct from the rear. He drove Bucephalus straight into the Persian line, spear lowered, eyes fixed on the nobility who had sworn to take his head. A Persian nobleman swung for him, the blade biting into his helmet, nearly splitting his skull. For a heartbeat, the world staggered. Alexander reeled. Another strike was coming. But Clytus the Black, his companion, intervened. With a single sweep, he cut down the noble before his blade could finish the young king. Blood filled the river. But the Macedonian line held. They pressed forward, teeth bared, until the Persians began to break. Cavalry wheeled, nobles fell, the trap became a graveyard of its makers. On the far bank, the Greek mercenaries waited for mercy. They received none. Alexander ordered them cut down to the last man. It was a message: those who fight for Persia will find no quarter. The Battle of the Granicus was not the largest clash of the war. But it was the first, and first battles write legends. Word spread like fire: the boy king had crossed into Asia, met Persia in open battle, and survived. More than survived, he had broken them. Yet victory carried its own shadow. Soldiers crawled from the riverbank, coughing water and blood, wounds torn wide by Persian blades. The bodies of men and horses alike washed downstream, caught in the reeds, faces bloated, eyes open to the sky. Villages near the crossing felt the punishment of war, fields burned, stores seized, families scattered. What had begun as a clash of kings now spilled into the lives of the forgotten. Still, the Macedonian army marched on, its confidence swelling. Sardis, the ancient city, surrendered without resistance. Ephesus followed. Cities long under Persia's hand now bent their knee to Alexander. Some welcomed him as a liberator, others bowed out of fear. For the Persian satraps, it was disaster. For Alexander, it was momentum. Every step deeper into Asia meant more soldiers fed by Persian grain, more silver flowing into his treasury, more allies swelling his ranks. But also, more eyes watching. Darius could no longer dismiss him as a raider or a reckless youth. The invader had to be faced. And so, while Alexander's men marched eastward, Persia prepared. Orders were sent. Armies raised. Messages carried to satraps, to nobles, to mercenaries still loyal to gold. Darius himself would take the field. The fire had been lit. But the flames were only beginning to rise. The boy king had won his first victory. But ahead lay an enemy far greater than rivers and satraps, the King of Kings himself. And when they met, the earth would shake. The year was 333 BCE. The road east was now lined with Macedonian victories, but also with graves. The Granicus had been only the beginning. Since then, city after city had fallen, satrap after satrap overthrown, and the dream of Persia's invulnerability had begun to crack. Yet Alexander knew, these were shadows of the real enemy. The King of Kings had not yet moved. That would change at Issus. The setting was a narrow plain between mountains and sea, where the river Panaris cut through marsh and sand. To the north, ridges rose jagged against the sky. To the south, the waters of the Mediterranean shimmered. Between them lay the corridor where two worlds would collide. Darius III had come in person. Not a satrap, not a general, the king himself. And he brought the weight of empire with him. A host of perhaps 100,000 men, Persians, Medes, Armenians, Syrians, Egyptians, mercenaries from every edge of his dominion. The royal chariot stood at the center, painted in gold, wheels plated, horses crowned. Behind him, his family, wife, daughters, mother, carried into the camp to watch his triumph. He believed this battle would end the invasion in a single day. The Persians filled the plain like a tide. Infantry massed along the river. Cavalry stretched far along the wings. Archers stood ready to darken the sky. From his high vantage, Darius looked down on Alexander's forces, smaller, compact, less than half his size. He saw not a threat, but prey. But numbers alone do not win wars. Alexander studied the field. The narrowness of the plain, once thought to favor Darius, now became his weapon. The Persians could not bring their full numbers to bear. Their vast host was bottled by the mountains and sea, forced into a corridor where only discipline and maneuver could decide the fight. And discipline was Alexander's kingdom. He placed the Macedonian phalanx at the center. Long spears, bronze helmets, a wall of men drilled to move as one. On the left, his Thessalian cavalry under Parmenion would hold the Persians at bay. On the right, Alexander himself with the companion cavalry, poised like a drawn blade. Then he advanced. The Persian archers loosed their storm. Arrows hissed and fell like black rain. Shields rattled. Men screamed. Horses bucked. But the Macedonian line did not break. Step by step, they pushed into the river, water rising to their knees, the clash of iron on iron echoing across the valley. At the center, the fighting became a furnace. Sarissas drove forward, punching through shields and flesh. Persian infantry hacked back, their curved blades slashing in tight quarters. Men slipped on wet stones, dragged under, crushed in the press. Blood filled the Paneras until it ran red, thick as clay. On the Macedonian left, Parmenions' men were under siege. Persian cavalry hammered them, wave after wave, hoofs pounding, spears striking, riders crashing into shields. For hours they bent, nearly breaking, the ground beneath them littered with corpses and broken lances. But they held. Barely. And then came the move. Alexander, on the right, saw the opening. With a shout, he spurred Bucephalus forward, the companion cavalry surging with him. They wheeled, angled, and struck, not at the Persian infantry, not at the riverbank, but at Darius himself. The charge was thunder. The wedge formation split the Persian line like an axe through wood. Dust and blood filled the air as Macedonian lances drove into noble ranks, cutting through guards, scattering riders. Alexander's eyes never left the golden chariot at the center. Darius saw him coming. For a heartbeat, the King of Kings held. Surrounded by his immortals, his chariot steady, his family watching from the rear. But courage is not the same as conviction. The sight of Alexander, relentless, cutting closer with every heartbeat, shattered him. Fear entered, and fear is a plague. Darius turned his chariot. Then he fled. The immortals, seeing their king abandon the field, faltered. The Persian center collapsed. What had been a wall became a rout. Tens of thousands turned and ran, throwing down arms, trampling their own in panic. The Macedonians pressed, killing without mercy. The river became a grave, the fields a slaughterhouse. On the Macedonian left, Parmenions' men, seeing the Persian retreat, surged forward, driving their enemies from the plain. The collapse was complete. The largest army the Persians had yet assembled was broken in a single day. But victory is measured not just in triumph, but in what it costs. When the sun set, the plain was a harvest of death. Corpses lay in heaps along the Paneras, faces twisted, armor broken, weapons rusting in blood. Wounded men crawled, crying for water, for mercy, for gods who did not answer. The smell of iron and rot carried on the wind. Among the captured were not just soldiers, but Darius' own family. His wife, his mother, his daughters, abandoned on the field by the king who had sworn to protect them. They were brought before Alexander. Soldiers expected violation, humiliation, the brutal spoils of war. Instead, Alexander did the unthinkable. He treated them with honor. He called them royal, not prisoners. He swore their dignity would be preserved. It was not mercy for its own sake. It was theater. Alexander understood the power of image. He was not just a conqueror. He was a new kind of king, one who could claim to be the protector of Persia as well as its conqueror. But beneath the glory, the suffering spread. Persian villages lay in ruin, fields burned, families torn apart. For the Macedonian dead, carts carried bodies back west, mothers waiting in vain for sons who would never return. Soldiers, hardened though they were, wrote in letters of horror. Of comrades drowning in red rivers, of cries that still rang in their ears when the campfires died. Issus was more than a battle. It was the moment the war became personal. Alexander had humiliated Darius, stripped him of his family, shattered his army. But in doing so, he had also unleashed the full fury of the empire. This was no longer a border war. This was a war for survival, for the very heart of Persia. Alexander had struck the King of Kings and left him in flight. But Persia was not yet finished. From Tyre to the deserts of Egypt, the war would grow darker, bloodier, and more relentless than ever before. Victory at Issus sent shockwaves across the ancient world. For the first time, the King of Kings had been seen fleeing the field. His army shattered, his family captured, his reputation scarred. Persia still held immense power, but the illusion of invincibility was broken. And Alexander, young, undefeated, merciless, now stood as the rising storm. Yet war does not move in straight lines. Between Issus and the final reckoning at Gaugamela lay trials darker and bloodier than any river crossing. The war was about to consume everything, cities, kingdoms, and thousands of lives. In 332 BCE, Alexander marched south. His path took him to the city of Tyre, an island fortress just off the Phoenician coast. Tyre was rich, proud, and vital to Persian control of the Mediterranean. But when Alexander demanded entry, the city refused. Tyre's walls rose more than 150 feet from the sea, sheer and unyielding. Its harbors bristled with ships, its people confident in the protection of Poseidon's waters. To most, it was impregnable. To Alexander, impregnable meant challenge. He ordered a causeway built, a massive bridge of stone and timber stretching from the mainland to the island. Day after day, soldiers, slaves, and engineers dragged rocks into the sea, raising a road toward the walls. Tyrian ships harassed the builders, burning siege towers, killing laborers. But the Macedonians rebuilt, each setback only sharpening Alexander's resolve. 7 months the siege lasted. 7 months of exhaustion, hunger, disease, and relentless death. Tyrian archers turned the waters red, filling the shallows with bodies. Macedonian prisoners were hung from the walls, crucified for their comrades to see. In response, Alexander pressed harder, building taller towers, longer engines, stronger defenses. Finally, in July of 332, the causeway reached the walls. Macedonian siege towers rolled forward, their engines unleashing a storm of stones and arrows. The navy, bolstered by ships seized from conquered ports, encircled Tyre. And then, at last, the breach opened. What followed was slaughter. Macedonians poured into the city, streets choked with fire and panic. Resistance collapsed into chaos. 8,000 Tyrians were killed. 30,000 more, men, women, children, were sold into slavery. The city that had defied Alexander was broken, its proud walls scarred with blood. Tyre was no ordinary victory. It was proof that no city, no fortress, no kingdom could resist forever. It was a message carved in stone and fire: surrender and live, resist and be erased. From Tyre, Alexander turned south again. Gaza resisted and was crushed. One city after another bowed, either by fear or by force. And then came Egypt. To the Egyptians, Persia had long been a foreign yoke. Alexander entered not as conqueror, but as liberator. He was crowned pharaoh in Memphis, hailed as son of the gods. In the desert of Siwa, he visited the oracle of Ammonius. Legend says the priests addressed him not as king, but as divine, the son of Zeus Ammon. Whether truth or myth, Alexander left Egypt cloaked in more than human authority. He was no longer just a warrior. He was destiny incarnate. And in his name, a city was founded, Alexandria. A beacon of Greek power, learning, and ambition, planted like a seed that would outlive him by millennia. But even as Egypt embraced him, the shadow of Persia loomed. Darius had not yielded. He gathered once more the strength of his empire, armies from the east, cavalry from the steppes, elephants from India. What rose in the Persian heartland was greater than anything Alexander had faced before. By 331 BCE, the stage was set. Darius commanded an army vast beyond counting, perhaps 200,000 strong, drawn from every corner of his realm. He had chariots fitted with scythes, meant to slice through enemy lines like harvest blades through wheat. He had elephants, armored and massive, meant to terrify horses and men alike. He had cavalry in overwhelming numbers. And he had chosen the ground. Near the village of Gaugamela, east of the Tigris, the Persians leveled the plain, clearing stones, smoothing earth, preparing a stage where their numbers could unfold like a seed. Here, Darius believed, the empire would crush the invader once and for all. Alexander marched north to meet him. His men, weary, scarred, reduced from years of campaigning, felt the weight of what was coming. They knew this was no satrap's levy, no desperate city's militia. This was Persia itself, summoned in full. The Macedonians numbered barely 47,000. Against them, the horizon glimmered with 100 banners, thousands of hooves, the gleam of iron in the morning sun. The air thickened with tension. Soldiers whispered prayers, sharpened blades, mended armor with shaking hands. Some had marched with Alexander since Greece. Others had joined along the way, drawn by loot or glory. All knew the truth, many would not return. But when Alexander rode the line, Bucephalus steady beneath him, he spoke with a voice that carried over the spears and shields. He reminded them of Granicus, of Issus, of Tyre. He reminded them that they had faced greater odds before and triumphed. He reminded them of home, of glory, of immortality in the songs of history. And his men roared in answer. The armies were assembled. The stage was leveled. And on the plain of Gaugamela, the fate of empires would be decided. The King of Kings had summoned his full strength. The boy from Macedon stood ready. When the sun rose over Gaugamela, the world itself would be reborn in blood. When the dust of empires settles, what remains? Is it the smoke of burning cities, the silence of graves, or the echo of names carved into stone? Alexander and Darius were not merely men. They were symbols of ambition and decline, of the hunger for power and the fragility of kingship. Their war did not just redraw maps. It reshaped the very idea of empire. The fall of Persia was not inevitable. The Achaemenids had ruled for 2 centuries, binding together peoples from Egypt to India, governing through tolerance and tribute, building roads and canals, creating an empire of unmatched scale. Yet when challenged, they crumbled, not because their soldiers lacked courage, but because their throne had lost conviction. Darius was a king by accident, not by destiny. He inherited not the strength of Cyrus, but the weight of weakness, corruption, and disunity. He had armies, wealth, and tradition. But when Alexander charged at Issus, when he lunged at Gaugamela, Darius fled. And in the flight of one man, the collapse of millions began. Alexander was the opposite. He inherited nothing certain, not even his throne. He forged everything in fire. He commanded not by tradition, but by presence. He fought at the front, risked his life, bled with his men. To his army, he was not just a king, he was the sharp edge of fate itself. Their collision was not simply a battle. It was the passing of an age, the death of an empire built on ancient roots, and the birth of one carried by relentless ambition. But what does greatness cost? The fields of Issus, the walls of Tyre, the plain of Gaugamela, they testify to the same truth. Greatness is bought with lives. Tens of thousands of soldiers who never saw their homes again. Civilians whose names will never be remembered. Cities wiped from the earth. Cultures scarred. Alexander's brilliance cannot be denied. His strategies are still studied 2 millennia later. His empire spread Greek language, science, and culture across continents. He created the Hellenistic world, a fusion of East and West that shaped centuries to come. But brilliance is not innocence. He left behind rivers of blood, endless graves, and the burning of Persepolis, a wound carved into memory. For every library he founded, a city was destroyed. For every culture he embraced, another was enslaved. What we admire, we must also question. For in war, even triumph is written in suffering. Clausewitz would later call war the continuation of politics by other means. Hobbes would call it the natural state of man. But in the story of Alexander and Darius, we see something older, something both timeless and haunting. We see that empires fall not only to stronger armies, but to weaker kings. We see that ambition can elevate a man beyond mortality, but also consume everything around him. We see that courage is not found in crowns or titles, but in the resolve to face the storm rather than flee from it. And perhaps the most enduring lesson, war is never clean. It is not marble statues or triumphal marches. It is blood in rivers, smoke in the sky, children left fatherless, kings murdered by their own. Behind every map redrawn, there is always a graveyard. The war between Alexander and Darius was over. But history does not rest. For the boy who had destroyed Persia was not content with empire, he hungered for the edge of the world itself. On-screen card, the legacy of Alexander versus Darius. The battle was done. The King of Kings lay dead on a lonely road, betrayed by his own. The empire of Persia, once the master of nations, was now the prize of a foreigner. And Alexander, the boy from Macedon, the son of Philip, stood as master of half the known world. But empires are not trophies. They are burdens. They are fires that demand more fuel. From the ruins of Persia, a new world emerged. Greek soldiers now drank from Persian cups. Persian scribes now served Greek rulers. Cities rose, Alexandria above them all, where Greek language, Persian wealth, and Egyptian faith collided into something new. The Hellenistic world was born, a fusion of East and West that would shape art, science, politics, and thought for centuries. Rome would rise in this shadow. The Silk Road would open in its wake. The spread of Greek philosophy, medicine, and astronomy across the Mediterranean and beyond owed its spark to Alexander's conquests. The world as we know it today still carries his fingerprints. Yet glory is fragile. Alexander would march further east, into Bactria, into India, forever chasing horizons, forever chasing immortality. His men would grow weary. His empire, though vast, would prove brittle, fragmenting after his death into rival kingdoms. For Darius, history was cruel. He became the symbol of a dynasty's end, remembered not for his reign, but for his flight. For Alexander, history was merciless. He became the symbol of ambition unchained, remembered not for peace or stability, but for endless war. Together, they show us the truth of empire. It is always written in fire, always fragile, always bought in blood. What happened at Issus, at Tyre, at Gaugamela, was more than the struggle of two kings. It was the hinge of ages. A moment when one world collapsed and another was born. It was the reminder that no empire, however vast, is eternal. That ambition can lift a man to the edge of godhood, but also grind entire nations into the dust. The lessons echo still. In every war, in every ambition, in every collapse, the shadows of Alexander and Darius linger. The conqueror and the king. The hunter and the hunted. The beginning and the end. If the fall of Darius was the grave of one empire, what Alexander did next would shake even his own men to their core. He would march beyond Persia, into deserts, jungles, and rivers no Greek had ever seen, chasing the edge of the world itself. Subscribe now, because the next story will leave you speechless.